Hey folks, I know I am just an old guy telling stories, but please leave a like and subscribe before we start. Let's enjoy in today's stories. Before I dive into today's stories, I want to say, disclaimer. The content presented in the video is purely for entertainment purposes only. The theories and stories discussed in this video are speculative and are not supported by any evidence or proof. Viewer discretion is advised. I don't know why I'm even writing this. Maybe it's a way to feel like I still exist. Maybe it's because I think someone, anyone, might stumble across this and figure out what to do. Or maybe I just need to get it out of my head before it drives me insane. Either way, if you're reading this, I need you to know this isn't some clickbait creepypasta, and it's not some dramatized urban legend. It's my life, my reality. A few years ago, I've completely lost track of how long it's been. I was broke. I mean, scraping pennies together just to get McDonald's from the dollar menu kind of broke. My job at the time wasn't cutting it, and I was barely making rent for my shoebox apartment in Chicago. To make things worse, my student loans had gone into default, and the emails and phone calls from debt collectors were relentless. The stress was unbearable. I felt stuck, like there was no way out. One night, after mindlessly scrolling through Reddit and half-heartedly Googling ways to make quick cash online, I came across a post in a forum I wasn't even sure how I ended up in. The title was simple: Earn $250,000 for participating in a psychological isolation study. The post itself didn't have much detail, which probably should have been a red flag. It just mentioned that the study was being conducted as part of an experiment on long-term sensory deprivation and social isolation. There was a link at the bottom, some sketchy-looking .onion URL. At first, I rolled my eyes and kept scrolling, but after about 15 minutes, I found myself staring at my empty bank account balance and thinking, what's the worst that could happen? I downloaded the Tor browser, something I'd only heard about from true crime YouTube channels and Reddit threads about the dark web. It felt strange using it, like I was stepping into a world I wasn't supposed to know existed. The interface itself wasn't that weird, just a stripped-down version of a regular browser. But the sites, they were on another level. Markets selling, let's just say, illegal stuff. Forums filled with conspiracy theories, and other things I honestly didn't want to know existed. I typed in the .onion link from the post and hit enter. The site that loaded wasn't as dramatic as I'd expected. It had a plain black background with white text and a logo that looked like a generic medical research emblem, something like you'd see on a pharmaceutical company's website. There was a short blurb about the experiment, followed by a questionnaire. I hesitated. My hands hovered over the keyboard. This wasn't some goofy BuzzFeed, "What kind of pizza are you?" quiz. This was asking for real personal information. My name, age, weight, height, medical history, and even psychological stuff like, have you ever experienced symptoms of depression or anxiety? How often do you interact with other people in a day? It felt intrusive, but again, the promise of $250,000 was hard to ignore. I convinced myself it was just a research group looking for data. Maybe they'd already recruited the participants they needed, and I'd never even hear back from them. Worst case scenario, I'd get a weird spam email or two. I filled it out. 2 days later, I got an email. It wasn't from the same .onion link, but it was equally shady looking. The subject line was, "You've been selected." It congratulated me for being chosen as one of the candidates for the study. Attached was a massive document, a contract with dozens of pages that I skimmed more than read. It outlined the conditions of the experiment, including the length of isolation, anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, depending on how well I performed, the payment schedule, and a legal disclaimer that the company was not liable for any emotional or psychological distress caused during the study. There were other weird clauses too, like agreeing not to disclose the study to anyone, even after it ended, and a requirement to surrender all personal belongings, including my phone, wallet, and anything that could be used for communication. I don't know why I wasn't more skeptical. The money blinded me, $250,000. That would wipe out my debt, let me start over, and maybe even buy a decent place to live. It sounded like freedom, and at the time, freedom was all I wanted. After I signed the contract electronically, things moved fast. I got another email a day later with instructions to meet at a hotel in the middle of nowhere, some roadside chain in Wisconsin. They didn't say why the location was so remote, but I figured it was just part of keeping the study secretive. When I arrived, a man in a plain black suit was waiting in the lobby. He looked unremarkable, early 40s, short hair, thin glasses, but there was something about him that felt off. He barely spoke, just nodded when I told him my name, handed me an envelope, and motioned for me to follow him outside to a nondescript white van parked out front. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper with a set of instructions. Do not bring any personal items. Follow all instructions given to you. The experiment will begin upon your arrival at the facility. I didn't even get a chance to ask questions. As soon as I climbed into the van, the guy closed the door, got into the driver's seat, and started driving. The ride took hours. At first, I tried to make conversation, asking the guy things like, "Where's the facility?" and "How long is the drive?" He didn't answer. After a while, I gave up and just stared out the window. The further we drove, the more isolated we became. The suburbs gave way to empty highways and then forests. Eventually, we turned onto a dirt road that seemed to go on forever. When the van finally stopped, it was in front of a massive, windowless building surrounded by a tall metal fence. There were no signs, no logos, just concrete walls and barbed wire. I thought about backing out. I really did. But the man in the suit was already opening the door, motioning for me to get out, and I felt like it was too late to turn back. Once inside, I was greeted by a woman in scrubs who introduced herself as Doctor. She had the kind of overly polite tone you hear from flight attendants, the kind that feels rehearsed. She handed me a hospital gown and told me to change. My street clothes were placed in a plastic bag, which I assumed they'd keep somewhere safe for me. After that, they walked me down a long, sterile hallway lined with doors, each one identical to the next. The place was eerily quiet. No buzzing lights, no faint chatter from other people, just silence. They led me to a small room at the end of the hall. It wasn't much larger than a walk-in closet. There was a bed bolted to the floor, a metal toilet in the corner, and a single fluorescent light overhead. "This will be your living space for the duration of the experiment," Dr. L said, her voice calm and detached. I remember laughing nervously and saying, "It's a little bare, don't you think?" She didn't laugh back. "You'll have everything you need provided to you," she said. "We'll monitor your vitals and mental state remotely. Food and water will be delivered through the slot in the door. You'll be free to sleep, exercise, or do whatever you like within the confines of this room." "And if I want to leave?" I asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped out, and the door closed behind her with a heavy clang. That was the last time I saw another human being. The first thing you need to know is that time doesn't mean anything in isolation. The fluorescent light above me didn't dim, didn't flicker, didn't turn off. It was always on, always buzzing faintly, not loud enough to be distracting, but just enough to remind me it was there. They didn't give me a clock or anything to measure the hours, so I had to rely on meals to keep track of the passing days. The meals arrived through a small slot near the bottom of the door. I'd hear a soft metallic scrape, and there it was, a plastic tray with food. Nothing special, usually just some kind of protein bar, a bottle of water, and occasionally a cup of something hot that might have been soup. It was enough to keep me alive, but never enough to feel satisfied. I always felt hungry. There was no schedule to it either. I couldn't predict when the next meal would come. Sometimes it felt like days passed before I'd hear the scrape of the slot, and other times I'd barely finish eating before another tray arrived. It messed with my head. I couldn't tell if they were trying to keep me disoriented on purpose or if they were just careless. At first I thought I'd be fine. I tried to make the most of it. The room wasn't much, but I figured I'd use the time to think. I made mental lists of everything I'd do with the money once the experiment was over. Pay off my loans, buy a decent car, maybe even travel. I'd never been outside the US before, but the idea of walking through the streets of Tokyo or sitting in a cafe in Paris kept me going. But that optimism didn't last long. After a while, my brain started to crave stimulation. There was nothing to do. No books, no TV, no phone. Nothing to occupy my mind except my own thoughts. I tried exercising to keep myself busy. Push-ups, sit-ups, pacing the length of the room. But there's only so much you can do in a space that small. I even started counting the tiles on the floor and ceiling just to have something to focus on. There were 32 on the ceiling, 46 on the floor. I counted them over and over, as if they might suddenly change. The worst part, though, was the silence. It was so absolute that I started hearing things that weren't there. A faint hum, like an engine idling somewhere far away. Clicking sounds like someone tapping a pen against a desk. Once I swore I heard a woman's voice whisper my name. I knew it wasn't real. I told myself it wasn't real. But that didn't stop my brain from playing tricks on me. The first time I tried talking to someone through the door, I thought maybe they were just waiting for me to initiate contact. Maybe this was part of the test. "Hello?" I said, my voice cracking from lack of use. No answer. "Hey, I know someone's out there. Can you hear me?" Silence. I tried banging on the door with my fists, thinking that might get their attention. The metal was cold and unyielding, and after a while, my hands started to ache. But I didn't care. I just wanted to hear something. "I don't care about the money anymore," I shouted. "You can keep it. Just let me out." Still nothing. That was when I realized this wasn't what I thought it was. I'd signed up for a controlled experiment, a scientific study with doctors and researchers who'd monitor me, ask me questions, and collect data. I figured there'd be regular check-ins, some kind of human interaction, even if it was just through a speaker. But no one spoke to me. No one came into the room. It was like they'd locked me in and forgotten I existed. I didn't understand. This wasn't in the contract, or at least not in the parts I actually read. Was this some kind of test to see how I'd react to being ignored? Or had something gone wrong on their end? For a while, I clung to the hope that someone was still watching me. Maybe there were cameras hidden in the walls or ceiling. Maybe the experiment was designed to push me to my limits, and they were waiting to see how far I'd go before cracking. But if they were watching, why didn't they respond when I spoke? Why didn't they stop me when I tried clawing at the edges of the door, leaving shallow scratches in the paint? That hope started to fade. Eventually, I stopped talking altogether. What was the point? My throat was dry, my voice hoarse, and no one was listening anyway. I stopped pacing, stopped exercising, stopped counting tiles. There was no point to any of it. I lay on the bed for what felt like days, staring up at the ceiling. The light never dimmed, never flickered. It was always there, buzzing faintly, an endless reminder that time was moving forward even if I wasn't. Sometimes I thought about my family. I hadn't told them about the experiment. They didn't even know where I was. I hadn't seen my parents in years, not since they retired and moved to Florida. And my friends, well, the few I had left wouldn't have noticed my absence. I'd pushed most of them away when things started falling apart in my life. Would anyone even notice if I never came back? At some point, days or weeks after I'd stopped trying to keep track of time, I made a decision. If no one was going to come for me, then I'd figure out a way to get out myself. I started examining every inch of the room, looking for weak spots. I checked the edges of the door, ran my fingers along the walls, and even pried at the corners of the ceiling tiles. Nothing. Everything was solid, seamless. It was like the room had been designed to be inescapable. But then I found something. It was small, barely noticeable, but in one corner of the room where the wall met the floor, there was a faint crack. It was so thin that I almost missed it. I knelt down and pressed my ear to it, hoping to hear something on the other side. Nothing. But it was the first real sign that the room wasn't as impenetrable as it seemed. I didn't know what I was going to do with that crack or how long it would take to make it bigger, but it was enough to give me a small sliver of hope. And in that moment, hope was all I had left. I don't know how long I spent obsessing over that crack. It became my entire focus, my reason to keep moving. Every time a meal came through the slot, I'd save the tray and try to think of ways to use it. The plastic wasn't strong, but it was hard enough to scrape against the wall. I started using the corner of the tray to dig at the crack, widening it little by little. At first it felt pointless. The walls were solid, reinforced with something harder than just plain drywall. But when I pressed my ear to the crack again, I thought I could feel the faintest draft. It was cold, like there was a larger space on the other side. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me going. The digging became my ritual. I didn't care about the mess. Flakes of paint, bits of plaster, and even dust filled the room as I chipped away at the wall. I used my nails when the tray wasn't enough, ignoring the discomfort because it didn't matter. I'd never been good at building things, but breaking them, that I could manage. The monotony of it all was broken one day, if I can even call it a day, by something unexpected. I was sitting on the bed staring at the scratch marks I'd made on the wall when I heard a loud clank. It wasn't the usual scrape of the food slot, and it wasn't coming from my door. It was coming from somewhere outside the room. I froze, straining to hear more. There was another sound, faint but distinct, like something metallic being dragged across the floor. It lasted for about 30 seconds before it stopped. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like I wasn't alone. But it wasn't comforting. It didn't sound like footsteps or voices, just that metallic dragging noise. I pressed my ear to the wall with the crack, hoping to hear something on the other side. But the sound was gone. Was this part of the experiment? Were they trying to mess with me to see how I'd react? Or was it just my imagination, my brain playing tricks on me again? I didn't know, and that was the worst part. I kept digging. It wasn't until much later, again I have no idea how long, that I made real progress. The crack had widened to about the size of a quarter, and I could finally see through it. Just barely. I had to crouch down and press my face to the floor to get the right angle, but when I did, I saw something. It was a corridor, long and dimly lit, with walls the same sterile white as my room. It stretched in both directions, disappearing into shadows at either end. But there was no movement, no people, no sign of anyone at all. The emptiness should have been comforting. It meant no one was watching me, at least not from that side. But it wasn't. It felt wrong, like I'd uncovered something I wasn't supposed to see. I tried whispering through the crack just to see if anyone might hear me. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Nothing. I kept working, widening the hole as much as I could. My hands were raw by this point, the edges of my nails cracked and filthy. But I didn't care. I was determined to get out, even if it meant crawling through that narrow opening like some kind of rat. The more I dug, the more I thought about the silence. It wasn't just in my room, it was everywhere. If this was supposed to be a research facility, where were the people, the staff, the other participants? The air in the corridor seemed stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. What kind of place was this? One day, or night, who knows, I stopped digging long enough to examine the food trays again. I'd been saving them, stacking them under the bed like they might come in handy later. I don't know why I hadn't done it before, but I started snapping pieces off the trays, trying to fashion something sharper. That was when I realized something odd. The trays were all identical. Same shape, same size, same cheap plastic. But the numbers stamped on the bottom were different. Each tray had a set of numbers etched into it like a serial code. At first I thought it was just a manufacturing detail, something meaningless. But then I started comparing them, lining them up side by side. They weren't random. The numbers followed a sequence like they were counting up. It started with something like 001025, and each tray that came after was slightly higher. 001026, 001027, and so on. I don't know why it bothered me so much. It was just a number, right? But something about it felt deliberate, like someone, somewhere, was keeping track of every single tray they sent me. What I couldn't figure out was why. If they'd forgotten about me, if this experiment had ended and they'd left me here by accident, then why were the meals still coming? And why were they numbered so precisely? It made me think about the metallic sound I'd heard earlier. If there was no one in the facility, then who or what was delivering the trays? I didn't want to think about it too much. The idea that I might not be alone, that something might be moving through those corridors, was more terrifying than the isolation itself. I tried to focus on the crack in the wall, but the questions wouldn't leave me alone. Who was behind this? Was it even a research experiment at all, or had I signed up for something much worse? I didn't have answers. All I had was a growing sense that whatever this place was, it wasn't what they'd promised. That night, or whatever passed for night in this endless fluorescent hell, I finally made the hole big enough to squeeze my hand through. It was a tight fit, and the edges of the hole scratched at my skin, but I didn't care. I reached through and felt around blindly, hoping to find, I don't even know what. A handle, a latch, something to open the wall from the other side. My fingers brushed against something cold and hard. It was metal with grooves that felt like wheels. No, not wheels. It felt more like tracks, like the kind you'd find on a drawer or a sliding door. I pushed, pulled, and twisted, but nothing moved. Whatever it was fixed in place, and then I heard it again. The metallic dragging noise. It was louder this time, closer. The metallic dragging noise was closer this time. I froze, crouched near the hole, holding my breath like that would somehow make me invisible. It wasn't loud, just a faint, rhythmic scraping, but in the absolute silence of that place, it felt deafening. I pressed my face against the crack in the wall, trying to see into the corridor, but the angle was too tight. All I could see was the same empty stretch of hallway. The sound echoed, bouncing off the walls, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from or how close it actually was. Was someone or something moving out there? I tried to tell myself it didn't matter. Whether it was a person, a machine, or just my imagination, I wasn't going to stop now. After a few minutes, the sound faded into the distance again, leaving me with nothing but the hum of the fluorescent light overhead. I turned my attention back to the hole. My hand had grazed something metal on the other side, rails or tracks maybe, but I couldn't figure out what they were for. My fingers were too big to maneuver properly in such a tight space, so I tore off another piece of the food tray and used it like a tool, poking around blindly. Something shifted. It was subtle, just a small click followed by a soft vibration in the wall. I froze, waiting for some kind of response. An alarm, a voice, anything. But nothing happened. The wall was still. The silence remained. I pulled my hand out and pressed my eye to the hole again. This time I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a faint line running vertically down the wall on the other side, almost like the seam of a hidden door. My heart raced as I crouched lower, trying to get a better view. It wasn't just a seam, there was something embedded in the wall near it. Something rectangular and faintly illuminated. A keypad. So, this wasn't just a blank corridor after all. There was more to this place, and it was hidden behind that wall. The discovery lit a fire under me. For the first time in what felt like months, I felt like I was making progress. The experiment, the isolation, the silence, I didn't care anymore. My focus was entirely on that keypad and the hidden door behind it. The problem was, I had no idea how to open it. I tried forcing the hole wider, but the metal underneath was too solid to break through. I thought about shouting, banging on the walls again, but I'd already done that before with no response. Whatever was happening here, whoever had designed this place, they weren't coming for me. I was on my own, and that's when it hit me. The numbers on the food trays. At first, I'd dismissed them as some meaningless manufacturing detail, but now I wasn't so sure. If the trays were being delivered by some kind of automated system, it would make sense for them to have tracking numbers, and if there was a keypad on the other side of the wall, maybe, just maybe, the numbers were a code. I pulled the trays out from under the bed and laid them out on the floor, arranging them in order. There were dozens of them, and I wasn't sure how many digits the code would be. 4, 6, more? I decided to start simple. The most recent tray had the number 001082 stamped on the bottom, so I crouched by the hole and whispered the numbers softly to myself, as if saying them out loud would somehow make the door respond. 001082. Nothing happened. I tried again, this time with the tray number that came before it, 001081, but the result was the same. The door didn't budge. For hours, or maybe it was days, I worked my way through every combination I could think of. I tried reversing the numbers, combining them, adding them together, anything that might make sense, but nothing worked. The keypad remained stubbornly unresponsive. By the time I was done, the floor was littered with broken pieces of plastic from the trays. My hands were raw and my throat ached from muttering the numbers over and over again. That sense of hope I'd felt earlier, it was gone. I was sitting on the floor, staring at the trays like they might somehow reveal the answer to me, when I heard the metallic sound again. This time, it wasn't faint or distant. It was close, right outside my door. I froze, my eyes locked on the food slot. For the first time since I'd been in that room, I felt genuinely afraid. Not because I thought something was coming for me, but because I realized I didn't want to know what was on the other side of that door. The sound stopped, replaced by a sharp click. A tray slid through the slot, just like always. But this time, something was different. There was no food on the tray. Instead, there was a small black object, flat, rectangular, and smooth to the touch. It looked like a key card, the kind you'd use to access a hotel room. I stared at it for a long time, turning it over in my hands. There were no markings on it, no indication of what it was for or why it had been sent to me. But I didn't need an explanation. The keypad. I scrambled back to the hole in the wall and slid the card through, using the edge of the tray to guide it. My fingers shook as I tried to maneuver it into place, and for a moment I thought I might drop it. But eventually I managed to slide it into the keypad's slot. There was a soft beep, followed by a low mechanical hum. The hidden door shifted slightly, just enough for me to see a sliver of darkness on the other side. It wasn't fully open. The mechanism must have been jammed, or maybe it was never meant to be opened manually. But I didn't care. I pushed against it with all my strength, ignoring the way the edges dug into my palms, until the gap was wide enough for me to crawl through. The corridor was colder than I expected. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been circulated in a long time. I stood there for a moment, disoriented by the sudden change in my surroundings. The hallway stretched out in both directions, just like I'd seen through the crack in the wall. But now that I was standing in it, I noticed something I hadn't before. Small black cameras mounted in the corners, their lenses pointed down the length of the corridor. And just a few feet away, lying on the floor near the wall, was the source of the metallic dragging noise. It was a cart. A metal cart like the kind you'd see in a hospital, with wheels that squeaked faintly as it moved. But it wasn't moving anymore. It was just sitting there, empty. I stood frozen in the corridor, staring at the empty metal cart. Its small, squeaky wheels were still, but I could tell it had been moving recently. There were faint smudges on the polished floor, like tracks leading away from it. The hallway stretched out into darkness in both directions. The lights here were dimmer than the fluorescent glare of the room I'd been trapped in, and for the first time in what felt like years, I felt unsteady on my feet. The cool air made my skin prickle, and the silence felt even heavier out here. I didn't want to move. The logical part of me screamed to go back to the safety of my cell, even if I hated it in there. But the rational part of me, the part that knew I couldn't survive much longer in that tiny, lifeless box, pushed me forward. I walked to the cart and inspected it. It was simple, utilitarian, like the kind you'd see being pushed by nurses in a hospital. There were a few scratches on the surface, and one of the wheels looked slightly bent, but aside from that, it was unremarkable. No food trays, no papers, no tools. It didn't tell me anything about who or what had been delivering my meals. I thought about the cameras I'd seen mounted in the corners of the corridor. Were they working? If someone had been watching me all this time, they had to know I was out now. But the lenses weren't moving, and there was no blinking light to indicate they were active. If they were recording anything, they weren't doing it in real time. Or maybe they'd stopped working a long time ago. I decided to move. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know where the hallway led or if there was even an exit. But standing still wasn't an option. The silence pressed down on me like a weight, and I needed to do something. The corridor seemed endless, the lights flickering faintly as I walked. Every few feet I passed doors just like the one I'd been locked behind. Most of them were closed, but one or two had been left slightly ajar, revealing rooms identical to mine, a bed, a toilet, and nothing else. Were there other participants? Had there ever been? The thought made my chest tighten. If there had been others, they weren't here anymore. I walked for what felt like hours, though it might have been only minutes. The corridor twisted and turned, splitting off into other hallways and stairwells, each one looking just as empty as the last. I tried to keep track of where I was going, but it was impossible. The layout of the place felt deliberately confusing, like it had been designed to disorient anyone who wandered through it. Eventually, I came across something different. At the end of one of the corridors, there was a large metal door. It was sturdier than the others, with a keypad and card reader mounted on the wall beside it. The sight of it gave me a strange mix of hope and dread. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the key card they'd sent me on the food tray. It was smooth and black, with no markings to suggest what it might unlock. I swiped it through the reader, holding my breath as I waited for a response. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the reader emitted a faint beep, and the door clicked open. I hesitated, my hand on the handle. This was it, my chance to finally get out of this nightmare. But as I pulled the door open and stepped inside, I realized I hadn't found an exit. I'd found a control room. The room was small, lined with monitors and equipment that looked outdated, like something you'd see in a government facility from the 1980s. Most of the screens were dark, their displays covered in dust, but a few were still on, showing static-filled feeds of the empty corridors I'd just walked through. At the center of the room was a desk, cluttered with papers, notebooks, and more key cards like the one I'd been given. I sifted through the papers, hoping to find some kind of explanation, but most of them were incomprehensible. Pages of data, diagrams, and charts with labels like Phase 3 Observations and Sensory Deprivation Study Results. I flipped through one of the notebooks, scanning the handwritten notes. Subject 004, 15 weeks, signs of severe cognitive degradation. Subject 008, removed after 9 months due to medical complications. Subject 012, terminated following protocol violation. My stomach turned. Subject numbers, not names. What happened to them? I kept flipping until I found a note that made my chest tighten. Subject 001025, indefinite extension approved. Contingency protocols initiated. No further observation required. That was my number, the one on the trays. My hands shook as I put the notebook down. Indefinite extension? No further observation? What did that mean? Had they abandoned me? Was I just Left here? Forgotten? I looked back at the monitors. Most of them were still showing static, but one in the corner caught my eye. It wasn't showing the corridors or my room. It was showing this room. The image was grainy, black and white, but there was no mistaking it. I could see the back of my own head, the desk, the papers I'd just touched. I turned around, scanning the corners of the room for the camera, but I didn't see one. I stared back at the monitor, my reflection staring at me from the static-filled feed. And then the screen flickered. For just a moment, barely a second, I thought I saw something else on the screen. A figure, not me, just standing there in the corner of the control room. But when I turned, the corner was empty. I don't know what this place is. I don't know who put me here or why they abandoned it, or me. But the worst part is I don't think I was ever meant to leave. The door to the control room is still open, but I can't bring myself to walk back out into the corridor. If I leave, where do I go? The hallways feel endless, and even if I find another way out, I have no idea what's waiting for me on the other side. For now, I'm staying here, writing this in the hope that someone will find it. Maybe this is part of the experiment, or maybe it's over and they just forgot I existed. But if you're reading this, don't sign up for something if you don't know what you're getting into. I don't know how much time passed after I found the control room. Days, months, it all blurred together the same way it always did. The only difference was that now I wasn't sitting in that tiny windowless room anymore. I was in the control room, surrounded by dark monitors, outdated equipment, and stacks of papers I'd gone over 100 times. The papers didn't give me the answers I was looking for. They were vague, full of scientific jargon I couldn't fully understand. But every so often I'd find something, an entry in a notebook, a line in a report, that made me feel like I was getting closer to the truth. And then, one day, I found it. It was tucked into the back of a manila folder, hidden beneath layers of spreadsheets and data charts. A photograph. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was an old black and white photo of a group of people standing in front of what looked like the same facility I was in. Scientists, I guessed. Some of them were holding clipboards, others smiling awkwardly for the camera. But one face stood out. He was standing near the center, his expression neutral but somehow familiar. It took me a moment to process why, but when I did, I felt the air leave my lungs. It was my dad. Let me back up for a second. My dad and I weren't exactly close. I mean, we weren't estranged or anything, but we'd grown apart over the years. He was always a bit of a workaholic, constantly traveling for conferences, staying late at his office, and missing birthdays because of important meetings. As a kid, I used to beg him to tell me about his job, but he never gave me a straight answer. "It's boring stuff," he'd say. "Research and data collection. You wouldn't understand." Eventually, I stopped asking. When my parents divorced, he moved out and we drifted even further apart. We'd still talk on the phone every now and then, usually around the holidays, but it was always surface-level stuff. "How's work? How's mom? Let me know if you need anything." But looking at that photo, I couldn't deny it. That was him. Younger, sure, probably in his 30s, but definitely him. The realization hit me in waves. He'd been part of this place, this experiment. He'd stood in front of this very building, smiling with his colleagues, while people like me were locked away inside. I tried to think back to the last time I'd spoken to him. It must have been years ago, before I signed up for this experiment. Had he known I was going to end up here? Had he been watching me all this time? My hands shook as I flipped the photo over. There was a date scrawled on the back, June 7th, 1998. That was almost 25 years ago. I stared at the photo, my thoughts racing. If my dad had been involved in this experiment, then he might still have access to this place. He might know I was here. He might have been the one who left me here. I don't remember making the decision to leave the control room. One moment, I was sitting there staring at the photo, and the next, I was walking down the corridor, the key card clutched tightly in my hand. I wasn't sure where I was going. Most of the doors were locked, and the ones that weren't led to empty rooms. But eventually, I found what I was looking for: a stairwell. The stairs were narrow and steep, leading up to a heavy metal door with a rusted handle. It took all my strength to push it open, but when I did, I was met with something I hadn't seen in years: sunlight. It wasn't much, just a faint beam streaming through a crack in the ceiling, but it was enough to make my eyes water. I stumbled forward, squinting against the brightness, until I realized I was standing in an old, crumbling lobby. The furniture was covered in dust, the windows boarded up, but the front door was wide open. I didn't stop to think. I just ran. Finding my dad wasn't easy. I didn't have my phone, my wallet, or any of my personal belongings. I didn't even know what year it was, or how far I'd been from civilization, but eventually I made it to a nearby town. I don't even remember the name of it. I just remember the stares I got from people as I wandered through the streets, barefoot and disheveled, asking for directions to the nearest library. It took me weeks to track him down. By the time I found him, I was living in a rundown motel, surviving off donated clothes and vending machine snacks. I'd managed to piece together enough information from public records and old photos to figure out where he was working, a private research firm in New York. I showed up at his office unannounced. He didn't recognize me at first. I can't really blame him. I looked nothing like the person he probably remembered. My hair was longer, my face thinner, and I was still wearing clothes I'd gotten from a donation box at a church. "Dad," I said, my voice shaking. He stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then, finally, he said my name. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice calm but tense. I didn't know where to start. My mind was a mess of questions and accusations, but the only thing I could get out was why. He looked at me like he didn't understand. Why what? Why did you do this? Why did you leave me there? His expression didn't change. If anything, he looked tired. "I didn't leave you there," he said quietly. "Then what happened?" My voice cracked as I spoke. "You knew I was there, didn't you? You were part of this whole thing." For a moment, I thought he might deny it. But then he sighed and gestured for me to sit down. "You don't understand," he said. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. The experiment, it was shut down years ago. Decades even." "Then why was I still there?" I demanded. He hesitated, his eyes darting to the door like he was afraid someone might overhear us. "I don't know," he admitted. "After the project was discontinued, the facility was supposed to be decommissioned. All the subjects were released, but..." He trailed off, his face pale. "But what?" He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Not everyone wanted the experiment to end," he said finally. "There were disagreements. People who thought we should keep going no matter the cost." "Are you telling me they just left me there?" I asked, my voice rising. He didn't answer. I never got the closure I was looking for. My dad claimed he didn't know who had kept the experiment running, but part of me didn't believe him. He'd been involved in this from the start, and whether he wanted to admit it or not, he'd played a role in what happened to me. I walked out of his office that day and never looked back. It's been months since then, and I'm still trying to put my life back together. Some days I feel like I've made progress. Other days I wonder if I'll ever be able to move on. The only thing I know for sure is that I'm never going to stop asking questions, because somewhere out there someone still knows the truth, and one day I'm going to find it. I'll be honest, I never thought I'd be the kind of person to buy anything off the dark web. But then again, desperation has a way of twisting your judgment. This isn't some wild story about being chased by shadowy figures or seeing something I wasn't supposed to. No, this is about a mistake I made that I'll regret for the rest of my life. It started about 2 months ago. My insomnia was killing me. Not in a haha, I need my coffee to function kind of way, but in the if I don't sleep soon, I might actually lose my mind kind of way. I'd tried everything: melatonin, lavender sprays, white noise machines, meditation apps, even those sleep hypnosis videos on YouTube. Nothing worked. My life was falling apart because of it. I'd show up to work at Starbucks. Yeah, I'm a barista, looking like a zombie, mixing up orders and forgetting how to spell Ashley on cups. I almost poured a caramel macchiato into the cash register once. My manager wasn't thrilled, to say the least. At home, things weren't any better. My roommates, Julia and Eric, kept nagging me about the noise at night. They thought I was pacing around the apartment because of anxiety or some kind of existential crisis. Truth was, I was just trying to tire myself out, hoping I'd collapse into bed and actually stay asleep for more than an hour. Spoiler, it never worked. I'd been lurking on insomnia subreddits and forums, hoping to find some miracle cure that I hadn't already tried. That's when I first heard about these experimental sleeping pills that supposedly worked like a charm. People in the comments swore by them, but the catch was they weren't exactly legal. Someone mentioned they'd found a vendor on the dark web selling them. Now let me be clear, I'm not some tech wizard or hacker. My experience with the dark web began and ended with those sensationalized YouTube videos where people talked about buying cursed mystery boxes or hiring fake hitmen. But the thought of finally getting a good night's sleep, it was too tempting to ignore. So I did what anyone would do. I Googled how to access the dark web. Don't laugh. After some digging, I downloaded the Tor browser and started exploring. The interface was weirdly basic, like something from the early 2000s. I had no idea what I was doing, so I followed a Reddit guide that pointed me to specific .onion links for marketplaces. The first few sites I visited were unsettling, not because they were scary or anything, but because of how casual everything was. You could buy fake passports, stolen credit card info, even snake venom. It was like browsing Amazon, but for illegal stuff. Eventually, I found a listing for Dream Sleeper Plus, the pills I'd read about. The description was vague, but it promised restorative, uninterrupted sleep with vivid dreams. The seller had a ton of good reviews, which somehow made me feel a bit better about the whole thing. The price was steep, $200 for a single bottle, but at that point I didn't care. Sleep was priceless to me. I created an anonymous email, bought some Bitcoin, which was a whole other headache to figure out, and placed my order. The seller promised discreet shipping within a week. True to their word, the package arrived 6 days later. It came in a plain, unmarked box, small enough to fit in my mailbox. Inside was a white bottle with a minimalist label that read, Dream Sleeper Plus, and some vague instructions. Take one pill 30 minutes before bed. Do not exceed the recommended dosage. Store in a cool, dry place. That was it. No ingredient list, no warning labels, nothing. The pills themselves were tiny and light blue, almost like the ones you'd get for allergies. I remember sitting on my bed, just staring at the bottle for a good 10 minutes. I felt a weird mix of excitement and unease, like I was about to jump off a high dive for the first time. That night, I decided to give it a shot. I set my phone to Do Not Disturb, dimmed the lights, and took a single pill with a glass of water. Within 20 minutes, I started to feel different. Not groggy exactly. It was more like my body was winding down while my mind stayed oddly sharp. I crawled into bed and closed my eyes. For the first time in months, it didn't feel like a battle to fall asleep. My muscles relaxed and my thoughts stopped racing. Everything went quiet, like someone had turned the volume down on the world. And then I dreamed. At first, it was nothing out of the ordinary, just fragmented images like a montage of random memories. I saw myself walking through my old high school, sitting at the Starbucks register, scrolling through Instagram. But then things started to shift. The scenes began to repeat, but with slight changes. I was back at my high school, but now the hallways stretched on forever, looping back on themselves like an Escher drawing. At Starbucks, I kept serving the same customer over and over, a middle-aged man in a red hoodie. On Instagram, the same photo of a sunset appeared in my feed every time I refreshed it. I woke up, or at least I thought I did. My bedroom looked exactly the same, down to the pile of laundry on my chair and the faint hum of the air purifier. But something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was like the edges of reality were just slightly blurred, like a JPEG that had been compressed one too many times. Then I blinked, and I was back in the dream. It wasn't like falling asleep again. It was instantaneous, like someone had hit a switch. The same scenes replayed, only this time they were more distorted. The high school hallways were now lined with doors that didn't lead anywhere. At Starbucks, the man in the red hoodie was gone, but his drink sat on the counter, untouched. And on Instagram, the sunset photo had a caption now. "Are you awake yet?" I don't know how long this went on. Time didn't feel linear anymore. I kept waking up, only to realize I was still dreaming. It was a loop, but it wasn't. Every time I thought I'd broken free, I'd find myself back in that endless cycle of fragmented dreams. And the worst part, I couldn't tell what was real anymore. When I finally opened my eyes for real this time, it took me a moment to convince myself I was actually awake. My phone was buzzing on the nightstand, the faint light of dawn creeping through the curtains. The time on the lock screen read 6:47 a.m. There was something weirdly comforting about seeing my notifications, texts from Julia, a reminder for an overdue rent payment, and a random email from Domino's offering me half off their overpriced pizza. I sat up, expecting the grogginess that usually followed a terrible night of sleep. But instead, I felt fine. No, more than fine. I felt rested. For the first time in months, my brain wasn't foggy, and my body didn't feel like it had been through a blender. Whatever was in those pills, they worked. Or at least that's what I thought at the time. The morning went by in a blur of normalcy. I showered, made myself a sad excuse for breakfast, frozen waffles if you were curious, and caught a few minutes of TikTok while sipping my coffee. Julia popped her head into the kitchen before leaving for her shift at the bookstore, muttering something about how it was nice to see me alive for once. By the time I got to work, the night before felt like a distant memory. I even told Eric about it when we swapped shifts behind the espresso machines. "I finally got some sleep," I said, loading another sleeve of cups into the holder. "Nice, dude," he said, glancing at his Apple Watch like he always does. "What did you do? One of those ASMR videos again?" I hesitated for half a second before shrugging. "Yeah, something like that." I wasn't about to tell him I bought unregulated pills off the dark web. Eric's the type of guy who'd immediately Google dark web at work and get himself fired for it. But as the day wore on, I started to notice something weird. It was subtle at first. Customers would come in and order the same drinks as usual: caramel lattes, cold brews, chai tea. But there was something off about the rhythm of their voices. Like they were saying the right words but in the wrong tone, too slow, too measured. At one point, a woman ordered a grande iced mocha, but she pronounced mocha like mock-ah. I'd never heard anyone say it like that before, but she said it so casually, like it was completely normal. I caught Eric giving me a look as she walked away, but I didn't say anything. And then there was the clock. The digital display on the wall had been broken for weeks. It kept skipping numbers or freezing entirely. But today, it wasn't just skipping numbers. It was glitching. At 2:13 p.m., I watched as the minutes jumped forward to 2:47, then back to 2:11 before finally settling on 2:30. It happened in the span of a few seconds. I blinked and shook my head, assuming my eyes were just playing tricks on me. By the time my shift ended, I felt more confused than tired. I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. That evening, I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. The apartment was unusually quiet. Eric was at his girlfriend's place, and Julia was pulling a late shift. The neighborhood felt normal enough, though. Kids riding bikes, some dude washing his car in the driveway, the faint smell of fast food drifting in from the McDonald's a few blocks away. But as I walked, I kept noticing these tiny, almost imperceptible glitches in the world around me. A street lamp flickered even though it was still daylight. The same kid on a bike passed me twice, wearing the exact same clothes and pedaling at the exact same speed. And at one point, I swear I saw a squirrel freeze mid-climb on a tree like someone hit pause on a remote. I know how all of this sounds, believe me, I do. If someone else were telling me this story, I'd probably laugh it off and say they were just overtired or paranoid. But it didn't feel like paranoia. It felt wrong. When I got back to the apartment, I went straight to my room and stared at the bottle of Dream Sleeper Plus on my nightstand. For a moment, I thought about throwing it away, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the memory of how good I'd felt that morning. Or maybe it was just stubbornness. Like I didn't want to admit I'd wasted $200 on something that might actually be messing with my head. Instead, I did what any rational person would do. I Googled the brand. Nothing came up. No official website, no reviews, not even a mention on the forums where I'd first read about it. It was like the pills didn't exist. The only thing I could find was an archived thread on some sketchy insomnia forum, where someone had posted about Dream Sleeper Plus nearly 2 years ago. The replies were a mix of curiosity and warnings, but the original poster never responded. That should have been my first red flag, but I was too stubborn, or maybe too tired, to take the hint. That night I decided to take another pill. I know what you're thinking. Why would I keep using them if they were already making me question reality? But here's the thing. I didn't know if it was the pills causing the glitches. For all I knew, I was just finally noticing stuff I'd been too exhausted to pay attention to before. So, I followed the same routine as the night before. Brushed my teeth, turned on Do Not Disturb, swallowed the pill, and waited for sleep to take over. This time it didn't come as easily. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling. My body was still, but my mind refused to shut off. I kept replaying the events of the day, the mocha lady, the glitching clock, the frozen squirrel, until I finally felt myself drifting off. And then, just like before, the dreams started. Only this time they were sharper, more vivid. I was back at Starbucks, but the cafe was completely empty. No Eric, no customers, not even the usual background music. Just me, standing behind the counter, staring at the register. When I looked down, I noticed that all the buttons were labeled with symbols I didn't recognize. They looked like hieroglyphs, but not Egyptian. More like something out of a made-up language. I pressed one of the buttons and the cash drawer popped open. Inside was a folded piece of paper with 2 words written on it. Wake up. I tried to move, to leave, to do anything, but I couldn't. It was like my body was frozen in place. The dream shifted then, melting away like wet paint sliding down a canvas. I woke up, again. Or at least I thought I did. When I woke up the second time, it felt almost identical to every other morning I'd ever experienced. My phone alarm was buzzing, the sunlight filtered through my curtains at the same angle, and the faint sound of Julia humming in the kitchen drifted into my room. Everything seemed normal, but there was a problem. I reached for my phone and froze when I saw the time, 6:47 a.m. again, the exact same time as the day before. At first I thought maybe my phone hadn't updated or something. You know how sometimes your devices glitch and show the wrong time until you refresh them? I unlocked it and stared at the notifications. They were the same ones I'd seen yesterday. The text from Julia, the Domino's email, even the stupid rent reminder. I sat up in bed trying to convince myself it was just déjà vu. I opened Instagram to distract myself, scrolling through the same feed I'd seen 100 times before. But as I refreshed the app, I noticed something strange. Every post was the exact same photo of a sunset, the same photo that had appeared in my dream. The caption was still there too. "Are you awake yet?" I immediately closed the app and got out of bed. My heart wasn't racing, my palms weren't sweating. I wasn't scared, but something about the whole situation felt fundamentally wrong. The rest of the morning unfolded just like it had the day before. Julia popped her head into the kitchen and said, "Nice to see you alive for once," before heading out. I ate my frozen waffles, drank my coffee, and tried to convince myself that I was just tired. Maybe my brain was playing tricks on me, pulling fragments from my dream and stitching them into reality. But by the time I got to work, I realized this wasn't just fatigue or déjà vu. It was happening again. The customers ordered the same drinks as the day before, down to the exact wording. The woman who said, "Mok ah," came in at the same time, wearing the same outfit, and left with the same awkward half-smile. Even the glitching clock on the wall repeated the same bizarre jumps in time. 2:13 to 2:47 to 2:11 to 2:30. Eric caught me staring at it and laughed. "Still broken, huh?" "Yeah," I muttered, trying to act like I wasn't slowly losing my grip on reality. But the real tipping point came later that evening. I decided to skip the walk this time. I didn't want to see the frozen squirrel or the kid on the bike again. Instead, I stayed in my room trying to make sense of what was happening. I pulled out my laptop and searched for every variation of repeating days, glitching reality, and dream loops that I could think of. Most of the results were useless, articles about sleep disorders or half-baked theories on Reddit. But then I stumbled across something that made me pause. It was an old post on a forgotten forum called Lucid Link, buried deep in the search results. The thread was titled, "Stuck in the Dreaming Loop," and the original post described a situation eerily similar to mine. The person claimed they'd taken an experimental sleeping pill and started experiencing hyper-realistic dreams that repeated themselves in subtle variations. They called it a dream within a dream, but they insisted it wasn't just lucid dreaming. It was something much deeper. There were a handful of replies, most of them dismissive, but one caught my attention. "If you're stuck in the loop, stop trying to wake up. The harder you push, the deeper you'll go." The comment sent a shiver, not in the horror movie sense, but more like the realization that I might have stumbled onto something I didn't fully understand. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the glowing screen in the dark. Was I still dreaming? That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to take another pill. As much as I wanted to sleep, I couldn't risk getting trapped in whatever was happening. I went through my usual routine, skipping the Dream Sleeper Plus bottle on the nightstand and settling into bed without it. But the thing is, even without the pills, I couldn't escape the dreams. I woke up again the next morning at 6:47 a.m. The same notifications, the same Domino's email, the same text from Julia. This time I didn't even bother going through the motions. I skipped breakfast, called in sick to work, and sat on the couch, staring at the muted TV. The world outside the window was eerily still, like it was waiting for me to do something. In my dream, or whatever this was, I realized I'd reached the point where I had two choices: try to break the loop, or accept that I was stuck in it. I wasn't ready to give up yet, so I did something impulsive. I grabbed my phone, logged onto the dark web using the Tor browser, and reopened the marketplace where I'd bought the pills. I was hoping to find some kind of warning, a refund policy, anything that could explain what was happening to me. But the listing for Dream Sleeper Plus was gone, not just unavailable, completely erased, like it had never existed in the first place. The seller's profile was blank, their reviews wiped clean. I scoured the forums, retracing my digital steps, but every mention of the pills seemed to have vanished overnight. That's when I noticed something strange in the corner of my screen. A tiny, flickering pop-up message. It wasn't there when I opened the browser, and I swear I hadn't clicked on anything, but somehow the message was there, blinking softly like it was waiting for me to notice it. It was only 4 words. "Do you feel awake?" I clicked it. The screen went black, not the usual black like when a website crashes or the power cuts out. This was a deep, empty void, as if the laptop itself had turned into a hole in the universe. My reflection stared back at me in the screen, illuminated by the faint glow of my bedroom lamp. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the void disappeared, replaced by a single line of text. "Wake up." The laptop shut itself off, leaving me sitting there in stunned silence. I reached for my phone and checked the time, 6:47 a.m. again. When I woke up again at 6:47 a.m., it felt like the ground had finally shifted beneath me. I didn't bother reaching for my phone this time. I already knew what I'd see. The same notifications, the same emails, the same reality stuck on repeat. I got out of bed and stood in the middle of my room, just thinking. If I really was stuck in some kind of loop, maybe it wasn't about breaking free. Maybe it was about figuring out why it was happening in the first place. That's when something hit me. What if the pills weren't just messing with my sleep? What if they'd done something to the way my brain processed time, or even reality itself? The idea seemed ridiculous, but then again, so did the concept of being trapped in a dream. I spent the morning going through every detail I could think of, looking for patterns. The thing about repetition is that eventually, you start to notice the cracks in the illusion. Julia's morning routine, for example. Every day she popped her head into the kitchen and said the same thing. "Nice to see you alive for once." But I realized she never actually made breakfast. The sink was always empty. No dishes, no coffee mug, not even crumbs on the counter. Outside, the neighborhood was just as frozen. The man washing his car. He was always wiping the same spot on the hood. The kid on the bike? He never rode past the same intersection. And when I looked at the sky, the clouds didn't move. It wasn't just déjà vu. It was like everything had been programmed to mimic reality but not actually exist beyond what I could see. By the time the afternoon rolled around, or at least when the clock said it was afternoon, I decided to test something. I went outside and walked toward the McDonald's down the street. I'd passed it dozens of times, but I'd never gone inside. If this loop was just recycling the same elements, then maybe doing something unexpected would reveal more cracks in the illusion. The automatic doors opened with a soft whoosh, and I stepped into the brightly lit lobby. The smell of grease and fries hit me immediately, and for a brief moment, I felt like I was back in reality. But as I walked up to the counter, I noticed something strange. The menu screens were blank. There was no one at the registers, no workers in the kitchen, no sound of sizzling patties or ice cream machines breaking down. The entire place was empty except for me and a drink sitting on the counter. It was a large soda cup with a straw sticking out of it. No logo, no branding, just a plain white cup with a black lid. Curious, I reached for it, but as soon as my fingers brushed the plastic, I heard a faint chime, like the sound of a notification. I turned around, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the lobby was still empty. Then I realized the sound was coming from my pocket. I pulled out my phone and saw a new notification at the top of the screen. It wasn't from any app I recognized. The icon was just a black dot, and the message read, "Leave it alone." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't explain. The drink on the counter hadn't moved, but I suddenly felt an overwhelming urge to get out of there. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the cup, as if it might suddenly do something. When I stepped outside, the world felt different. Not dramatically so, but enough to make me pause. The air was too still, the sky too bright, and the sounds of the neighborhood too distant, like I was standing inside a giant photo instead of the real world. Back at the apartment, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the bottle of Dream Sleeper plus pills. They hadn't moved from the spot where I left them the night before, but now they felt heavier somehow, like they were watching me. I wanted answers, but I was also terrified of what might happen if I kept pushing. Every warning I'd read online came flooding back. The harder you push, the deeper you'll go. But if I didn't figure this out, I knew I'd be stuck in this endless loop forever. So, I did something reckless. I took the bottle, shook out 2 pills instead of 1, and swallowed them dry. The effects hit faster this time. Within minutes, the world around me began to distort. Not in the dreamlike way I'd experienced before, but in a way that felt technical. The kitchen lights flickered, and the walls seemed to ripple like I was watching them through heat waves. My phone buzzed again, and when I checked it, the screen was blank except for a single word. Why? Before I could react, the world dissolved around me. I was back in my dream, or at least that's what I thought at first. But this time, there was no high school hallway, no Starbucks counter, no Instagram sunsets. Just a vast, empty void that stretched out infinitely in every direction. And yet I wasn't alone. In the distance I could see something moving. Not a person, not an animal, but a shape. It was blurry and undefined, like a glitch in a video game. As it got closer, I realized it wasn't moving toward me, it was circling me. I tried to speak, to call out, but no sound came from my mouth. The shape stopped circling and seemed to flicker, like a bad connection on a Zoom call. Then, in an instant, it vanished, only to reappear directly in front of me. It wasn't a shape anymore. It was me. The other me stared at me with an expression I couldn't read. It wasn't angry or sad or happy. It was just blank, like a mannequin wearing my face. Then it spoke, but its voice wasn't mine. It was distorted, layered, like 100 voices speaking at once. "Do you understand now?" it asked. I tried to respond, but again, no sound came out. The other me tilted its head, as if waiting for an answer. When I didn't give one, it took a step closer and whispered something that sent a ripple through the void. "Wake up." And just like that, I was back in my bed. The clock read 6:47 a.m. When I woke up, if you can even call it that, it was still 6:47 a.m. I didn't move right away. Instead, I stared at the digital clock on my nightstand, watching the numbers. I wanted them to change, to move to 6:48 or 6:49, anything to prove that time was still flowing, but they didn't. I sat up and rubbed my eyes, half expecting the world to ripple or glitch like it had the day before. But everything seemed still, too still. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't follow my normal routine. No breakfast, no scrolling through my phone, no waiting for Julia to pop her head into the kitchen. Instead, I just sat there, letting the quiet sink in. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a dream loop. It was more than that. Something bigger, something wrong. By noon, or what I assumed was noon, I decided I couldn't just sit around waiting for answers. The pills had to be the key. They'd started this whole mess, and if I wanted to get out, I needed to understand what they'd done to me. I grabbed the bottle from my nightstand and inspected it again. There were no clues, no hidden labels, no strange markings, just the same vague instructions I'd already read 100 times. Then, out of pure desperation, I pried the plastic label off the bottle. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe a secret message or some hidden ingredient list. But instead, I found something much stranger. Underneath the label was a QR code. I scanned the code with my phone, half expecting it to lead nowhere. But instead, it took me to a plain, black web page with a single sentence at the top. "Dreaming is the only escape." Below it was a download button. I hesitated. Every rational part of me screamed not to press it, but I was past the point of rationality. If this was a dream or some kind of simulation, then what did I have to lose? I tapped the button. My phone screen went black for a moment before displaying a strange image. It looked like a top-down view of a maze, the kind you'd find in a kid's puzzle book. At the center of the maze was a tiny red dot, blinking slowly. Underneath the maze were 3 words: "Find your way." I didn't understand what I was looking at, but the second I glanced away from my phone, I froze. The walls of my bedroom had disappeared. In their place were tall, endless hedges, just like the maze on my screen. The air smelled faintly of grass and damp earth, and when I turned around, I realized the bed I'd been sitting on was gone too. It wasn't a dream anymore, or if it was, it had evolved into something far more real. I took a deep breath and started walking. The maze felt endless. Every path seemed to loop back on itself, and no matter how many turns I made, I couldn't find the center. My phone buzzed every few minutes, showing me the blinking red dot and a new message. Wrong way. Try again. You're getting closer. But I wasn't sure if I was getting closer. The hedges all looked the same. The air felt heavier with every step, and the blinking red dot never seemed to move. At one point, I stopped and sat on the ground, trying to make sense of everything. That's when it hit me. What if the maze wasn't meant to be solved? What if the point wasn't to find the center, but to realize I didn't need to find it at all? With that thought in mind, I stood up and did something I hadn't tried before. I turned around and walked back the way I came. The hedges rippled, like water disturbed by a pebble. The path behind me began to dissolve, crumbling into tiny pixels until there was nothing left but empty space. I kept walking. The further I went, the more the maze unraveled. The hedges, the dirt paths, even the sky above, it all dissolved into a black void, leaving me standing alone in the darkness. And then, just like before, I saw it. Me. The other me appeared without warning, standing just a few feet away. But this time it didn't look blank or emotionless. It looked tired. "You figured it out," it said, its voice softer now, almost human. I didn't say anything. I just stared, waiting for it to explain. "You're not stuck in a dream," it continued. "You're stuck in your mind. The pills didn't trap you. They woke you up to the truth." "The truth about what?" I finally asked. It smiled faintly, but there was no joy in it. "That none of this is real. Not the pills, not the loop, not even the life you thought you were living." My head spun as I tried to process what it was saying. "Then what is this?" I asked. "If it's not real, what is it?" The other me tilted its head. "A choice." Before I could respond, the void around us began to ripple. For a moment, I thought I saw flashes of my room, my bed, my phone. But they were fading, like a distant memory I couldn't quite hold on to. "This is your chance to wake up," it said. "The real you is waiting, but you have to decide." I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The void grew darker, the flashes of my room dimmer, until there was nothing left but the other me waiting for an answer. And then, without thinking, I closed my eyes and whispered, "Wake up." When I opened my eyes, I was staring at my bedroom ceiling. The clock on my nightstand read 6:48 a.m., and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, time was moving again.